Welcome to our students. I'm Mr. Martinez.
I'm Miss Garcia.
Mr. Santiago here.
And this is History Talks. That's right. If you don't remember, History Talks is your pre-recorded lesson here in World History class, where you're going to be asked to participate in today's lecture by not only listening and learning today's lesson, but of course the video is going to have some small checkpoints in between to make sure that you are understanding the new lessons that are happening today. Alrighty, and today we do have a fun topic. We've been preparing for it for all these weeks. We're talking about the rise of totalitarianism, but now specifically the aggression and appeasement of it. Essentially, these are the first steps until the actual fighting of World War II. And we're going to see, how does the world try to handle these totalitarian nations? Let's go ahead and move on to the next thing. Let's get a quick understanding of what we are learning today. Super important. What is the main thing? Take a look at our standards. Our goal today is to compare the German, Italian, and Japanese drives for empires in the 1930s, including the 1937 rape of Nanking, other atrocities in China, and the Stalin-Hitler Pact of 1939. So essentially, we're learning the first steps these totalitarian regimes do once they have ambitions to take over more than just their countries. But before we dive in, we gotta remember those previous lessons. We have to do a quick recap here, folks, especially with the word totalitarianism. We should know what that word is, and if you don't, here's your last reminder of it. Our class definition, once again, is a concept for a form of government or political system that prohibits opposition parties, restricts individual opposition to the state, and it claims an exercise of extremely high degree of control over public and private life. And the name of the game for totalitarianism is really just total control. And we now know that in our history lessons, we have names to go with these totalitarian leaders, as we talked about their rises in their countries, like Germany with Hitler, Italy with Mussolini, and last but not least, Soviet Union with Stalin. We know that they succeeded in taking over their countries with all these other methods and characteristics of their regime. And we know that they have a growing want of more control, especially with how things were done in the end of World War I. If you remember that World War I lesson, especially to who are the winners and the losers, you're going to see a lot of the losers from World War I trying to have a rematch in World War II. So there is a big connection, especially with who was angry with the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles. But for today's lesson, this is the essential question. This is the thing you need to be able to understand by the end of this lecture. The question is asking, describe the aggressive actions of a totalitarian regimes and the responses of the Western democracies. So not only understanding the first steps of these leaders, but how does the world respond to them? Do we respond with justice and accountability, or do we start to try to do other things? And did it work? That's the focus for today. You know from our previous lesson, we know that there's a different method going to be used, something along the ideas of appeasement. And if you can't remember from that last lesson, appeasement is the policy of agreeing to the demands of a potentially hostile nation in the hope of maintaining peace. But when we say the word aggression, don't forget aggression just simply means when one country uses military force to take away from another country. So using violence and action to get what they want.
All right, guys, so we're just going to review some of the paths towards aggression that are occurring during this time period. We're going to start on the left-hand side. World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles. And we all know that there are lots of countries, specifically Japan and Germany, who are not so happy with the outcome. We know that there are some countries who are sympathetic to their anger about the Treaty of Versailles, and there are still some other countries that believe Germany got what they deserved. We have the rise of totalitarian dictatorships in Italy, in Japan, in the Soviet Union, and Germany. After World War I, Italy did not receive land, and that is another reason why Italy was upset. Also, Japan felt like they were not represented fairly at World War I conferences. Also, we have Germany, and they again were upset with the Treaty of Versailles and the cost of reparations. We have to remember, they are having to pay back all of the costs of World War I, and it's a huge number that they don't have. They just went through a war. And so for them to have the money to pay that back is just not something that they're going to be able to do. But in addition to that, our last step before World War I is that Italy, Germany, and Japan begin acts of aggression, which we just reviewed earlier, towards their neighboring territories. So let's just review some of our key players. We have totalitarian dictators. Now, all of them together are totalitarian dictators, but we have two different types. The first is Stalin. Stalin is a communist totalitarian dictator. That is a method in which he controls his government and his economy. The other group that we have is fascist totalitarians. We have Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, and now we have a new character, Hideki Tojo in Japan. He takes rise in 1940 through 1944. He is also a fascist dictator, and we'll go over him in just a few more slides.
But as you guys are noticing, there's a new country we're talking about. Every time we've mentioned history, it feels like we're very Europe-centric with it, especially when we talk about these totalitarian regimes. But don't be too fooled in the idea that those ideas are just in that continent. They spread. And you'll see that within the Asian plains, there is some also developments of totalitarianism going on. So, as you guys can see from this presentation, we're talking about Japanese imperialism and their spread. During the European imperialism, Japan, a nation that wasn't taken so seriously, was observing the Europeans making a lot of gain. And they said, why is it that they can get away with it and we can't? They decide that they are going to also be expanding their nations as they feel with their nationalism that they have the right to do the same thing that those European nations are doing. And they're going to start expanding within the European landscape. I'm sorry, the Asian landscape that you see from this map right here. As you can see, Japan is an island. And when you're an island, there's some pros to it, but there are some cons to being on an island, especially when it comes to imperialism and resources. How do you get more resources if you only have this much amount of land? Typically, you at that point have an ambition to spread to close neighboring places to acquire things you don't have. And that's what you see Japan does. It begins to imperialize in the Pacific Ocean, taking a lot of islands. And not only do they start to follow the books of imperialism and totalitarianism, but they start to get along with the other nations in Europe that are totalitarian, and they start to create an alliances. So all these guys that have these radical ideas are starting to gang up and start to create a group. How does the world respond to when Japan starts doing this and starts invading and taking other countries? Well, there's many numerous things that happen, but one in particular that becomes a big deal for World War II is the United States, which is a country that hasn't put its official stance in World War II. They've been playing neutral so far. When they hear about the invasion and the gruesome things Japan does to the places they occupy, they start to sanction resources. If you don't know, sanction means to limit, to prevent, to almost like ground somebody of something, right? And one thing that the Japanese really depended on America was oil. Oil making the world go around, that's true for the military, and especially for Japan's war engine. So when the United States started to sanction their oil, Japan responded with more aggression. The aggression that we start to see that results in the Pearl Harbor bombing that happens in Hawaii. This is a huge event that leads to America getting involved in more world issues. So are the Japanese, like, are their regime very similar to the Europeans? Like, did they just copy and paste and it's just like their thing? Or was it a little bit different on the way they were handling things? And when I say atrocities, things that they were doing that were bad, are we talking like Hitler bad? Well, take a look right here, folks. We know that with totalitarianism comes something called nationalism, which is that like that fever of like hyper pride, right? Where you have so much pride for your country that you're willing to die for it. You're willing to kill for it. Well, the Japanese did a similar thing. They used a lot of ultra nationalism and a lot of propaganda to get their citizens and their country ready to be an empire. And that was really what they were trying to push, to be an empire that was equal to the Western powers, because they felt they weren't being taken seriously. And the only way they will is with power, like all these other countries. So what are their first few actions? Well, you see that they go into different provinces in China, especially this one that's really debated called Manchuria. In 1931, they start to invade this area. And they start setting up their own puppet government where they essentially still have full control over the resources and the land they just acquired. Now, what does the world do when they hear about a totalitarian government attacking? Well, at this point, everyone is a little hesitant to be accountable on these people, because they know that might require money and possibly war, which everyone is super tired of after World War I. So the only thing that happens is this group of international countries called the League of Nations meaning the first worldwide organization, a group of countries that are supposed to promote peace. They give a small slap on the wrist to Japan saying, shame on you for doing that. And that's it. A warning, some sanctions, but Japan simply said, forget your club. I'm going to do what I think is best for my empire. And they continued to do that. Now, it leads to a lot of things, a lot of problems. In 1937, Japanese armies do overrun much of China as they continue to spread and invade now that they don't care about what people think. And the Western world protests about it, says, you know, that's a bad thing, but doesn't do much more after that. But back to the atrocities. When the Japanese invade China and all these other places, are they kind? Are they like Hitler, or are they different? Well, with totalitarianism comes aggression, comes suppression and violence, and it's true for Japan too. They had some serious issues, some being very infamous, especially when it came to the attacking of a capital called Nanking. Now, what happened essentially is these Japanese military began to try to control society, and they tried to wean out those who weren't going to listen to them, which essentially led to them butchering 150,000 male war prisoners. So instantly executing ex-military who weren't on their side from China. Besides that, it wasn't just soldiers that were taking the violence, it was everyday citizens. You saw tons of cases of rape incidences where at least 20,000 women of all ages were raped during the pillaging of Nanking and the occupation of it. And those who didn't listen were mutilated, which essentially is cutting off parts of their bodies. essentially their head. Once again, what does the world do when they hear about people being raped and decapitated by this totalitarian regime? Well, they continue to sanction, but they still say we're not going to intervene because that's not our problem, because they don't want to go to war. That's true for both US and European nations. There was not a lot of action made because so many were reluctant. So while all this was happening, Japan continued to attack and take much of the Pacific during that time.
Oh, I heard butchered. I heard decapitated. But why? Why does Japan begin acts of aggression in the Pacific? Again, we want to ask you guys this. Why does Japan begin acts of aggression in the Pacific?
Answer that now to continue forward. Great job. Thank you for responding to that. There's a lot of different things of aggression, but it's that ambition of imperialism and empire that they wanted. Good job.
Now that we have covered some of the acts of aggression in Japan, we're going to go back over to Europe and we're going to consider and talk about some of the acts of aggression in Italy. Again, we have our Italian dictator, Mussolini, and then we have a new player down here. We're going to talk about him in a second. Italy has their own goods for imperialism, and always that means that they are wanting resources and access to new markets. Italians were defeated in Ethiopia in, I gotta move my screen, in 1896. And in 1935, Italy returns to Ethiopia to settle the score. For those of you who may not know, Ethiopia is this country down here in Africa. And again, you can see Italy is up here at the top of the map. They had a war, they lost, they come back, and they want to settle the score again. So what happens when Italy returns to Ethiopia? Unfortunately, Ethiopians did not have the military technology to defend themselves from tanks, machine guns, and poison gas in airplanes that Italy brought to this new conflict in 1935. Also, Ethiopia appeals to the League of Nations. Remember, we talked about the League of Nations previously. Their organization worldwide, and their intent is to keep world peace. Are they keeping world peace? I don't know. Let's talk about that. The Ethiopian emperor goes to the League of Nations. That's him in his black uniform with lots of medals. And he says, if you do not impose sanctions, God and history will remember your judgment. It is us today, it will be you tomorrow. Keep that in your mind, right? He's saying, if you don't help us today, we may be defeated today, but tomorrow it will be you who they are attacking. He's kind of foreshadowing what's going to happen in a lot of other places. Unfortunately, the League of Nations agrees to stop selling weapons or war materials to Italy, but they do continue to sell petroleum or gas, which was used by military equipment. So again, you see that gas and oil are very important during wartime. We know that they posed sanctions in Japan earlier, but they don't pose oil sanctions on Italy. That means that Italy is able to use those tanks and all airplanes as they enter into Ethiopia. Also, the League of Nations has no authority to enforce sanctions in Italy. They have no army. And as we saw in Japan, they can slap them on the wrists, but that's only going to do so much. The League of Nations does not become a powerful authority until later on in history.
All right, guys, as Mr. Martinez said earlier, the word sanctions, we want to think of limits, or as Ms. Garcia said, restrictions. So how effective were the sanctions imposed against Italy? Again, how effective were the sanctions imposed against Italy?
Well done. Good job for responding to that. A lot of different reasons for those sanctions, but not exactly effective when stopping the expansions and the ambitions of these leaders.
We talked about Japan and our new character, and we talked about Italy and their involvement in Ethiopia. Again, we're going to come back to Europe and we're going to discuss some of the German acts of aggression. We all know this guy here, Hitler, and we all can remember that there is Germany and the surrounding territories. So let's talk about how things begin to escalate in Germany. Germany violates the Treaty of Versailles. Shocker, spoiler alert, Hitler does something he said he wasn't going to do. Germany is determined to rebuild their army and strength in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany also sends troops into the Rhineland, which is a buffer zone between France after World War I. A little bit of back history. The Rhineland has been fought over for centuries between Germany and France. They both think that it belongs to them. So they fight over back and forth. Who is going to have the Rhineland and who's going to be protected by that buffer zone? After World War I in the Treaty of Versailles, the Rhineland is handed over into France. That severely upsets the Germans. And as they are beginning to commit acts of aggression, that's one of the first things that Hitler does. In order to please the people of Germany and in order to build their strength, the Germans enter into the Rhineland. Also, Germany continued acts of aggressions against its other nations, or neighbors. The German justification for these acts of aggressions against their neighbors was the reunification of the German Empire, or as Hitler described it, the Third Reich. His reasoning was the Alsace-Lorraine, Austria, the Sudetenland, and part of Czechoslovakia had 3 million German speakers. And they believed that because they were German speakers, that all of that land should be unified into one German empire, one Third Reich. We also know that in response to German acts of aggression, the Western democracies chose appeasement in order to keep peace, and Hitler promises no further aggressions. So he has already entered into the Rhineland, and he has made threats that he will begin to enter into Czechoslovakia and Austria. But he promises not to go any further. What do you guys think? You think Hitler's going to stop there? Is he going to be happy with just that? I don't know. Well, I do know. You don't know. I know what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine a lot of students thinking right now, wait, you're telling me the guy who broke the rules of the Treaty of Versailles is starting to take stuff away. And when the people who wrote the rules of the Treaty of Versailles found out, they just said, okay, you can have it, but no more. That was the appeasement?
That's what happened.
Wow, man, the more Mr. Martinez and Ms. Garcia speak, the more I'm starting not to like the word appeasement. Anyway, here we go, checkpoint. Describe Germany's act of aggression and the response of the Western democracies. Again, you're gonna describe Germany's acts of aggression, what did they do, and the response of the Western democracies.
Very good job. Thank you for doing that. There are tons of aggressions and tons of not enough responses from the Western democracy that seems like it's really holding them down, right? So going into our next thing, when we keep saying Western democracies, who are we talking about? Who are we referring to when we're talking about that? Well, these gentlemen to the right are the big main key characters for what we say as Western democracies. These are essentially the winners of World War I, who are trying to make sure there's some accountability of the losers from World War I as they try to come back in this rematch. But as you guys can tell in their actions, they're not standing up. They're not going straight to justice when things are going wrong. Instead, there's like this hesitanceness. So what's going on? What happened to the winners from World War I? Well, you have to know and understand that after World War I, no one was having fun. Not the winners, not the losers, no one was having fun. There was economic depression. There were so many countries that had so many problems that they reduced their militaries to try to solve their domestic problems. So now not a lot of countries have their big armies anymore, and they're kind of outdated. since this is new technology. So a lot of them don't want to use violence or military as their first weapon. They're essentially demoralized after World War I and don't have the resources to fight or resist these people like Germany. So what you start to notice is that they're not capable of holding stability, right? These powerful groups with Britain and France believe the Treaty of Versailles potentially caused some of these new issues they're seeing, because they felt like, ooh, maybe we went too hard on blaming the losers and making Germany in particular pay for the whole bill. So they're starting to catch on that, oh, maybe we didn't really solve World War I. We're just like on a pause. So all of the Western powers believe fascism was preventing the spread of communism, which they feared was worse. So one of the theories a lot of people say is that, well, the reason why they were letting them go through and spreading is because they thought the bigger villain was communism. And even though fascism is really scary, it's not as scary as communism, so we'll accept it and let them do their thing, and maybe that will help us. Some people theorize that was why there was a lack of response. Others really focus on that Great Depression, the hurt of the economy, and people really not focusing. Others like to think of the idea that the Allied powers were trying to like prepare themselves and buy more time, but buy more time at the expense of everyone else who's being invaded, like Ms. Garcia was saying. So overall, you see the main theme of their decisions, these Western powers, is something called pacifism, which is essentially them not being holding people accountable anymore. They're letting things slide because they're afraid to make actions and what that would require. So people like the United States in particular, they start to wipe their hands from this problem, and they call a neutrality act, which was their best way of trying to say, we're on the sidelines, but if you need any resources or anything, we'll definitely sell them to you. But we're not on any one side. You see a lot of restrictions that they start to create on investing in the war or trying to get themselves involved, which eventually falls apart, especially after the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
All right, considering what Mr. Martinez just went over, why did Western democracies choose appeasement instead of conflict? Again, why did Western democracies choose appeasement instead of conflict?
Very nice. Good job for responding to that. Lots of different reasons you can see that you can mention within that section.
We talked a little bit about the Western democracies. Let's talk about the formation of the Axis powers. We're going to want to keep that in the back of our head, file that away, the Axis powers, because we're going to be referring to them quite a bit in the next couple of units. And just generally in history, you're going to hear a lot about the Axis powers. So who exactly are the Axis powers? They're some of the same characters that we've been talking about and discussing before. In Germany, we had Hitler. In Italy, it was Mussolini. And in Japan, they have Tojo, okay? They were seeds that we just saw before, and their lack of action or their pacifism. They decide to form essentially an evil boy group, right? And they are the Axis powers. They decide that they're not going to interfere in each other's territorial expansion. So they're going to gobble up as much of the world as they can, and they're just going to keep out of each other's own backyards. They agreed that they were going to do one thing, though, that they are going to fight communism. So they all turn their back on Stalin, and they decide just to join up together as the Axis powers. Together, they were more emboldened to take more anti-democratic aggressions. So they see that individually they are committing these acts of aggressions against their neighbors, and they think, well, if they're not doing anything to each of us individually, I bet you if we all link up, they're especially not going to do anything to us. And that's basically what happens. The Axis powers flex their power during the Spanish War in Spain, not just like a Spanish language war. They're literally fighting in Spain. Okay, it's a civil war. So what's going on in Spain? Well, they sent support to the fascist leader, General Francisco Franco. This is him right here, dressed in his nice little cape with a fur on it. So he was a fascist, and they sent support to him and his military. However, Stalin, who they turned their back on, he said, oh, you're not going to get me. He decides to send support to the Spanish loyalists. Then France, Britain, and the United States, again, remember, they really don't want to get involved in anything. One, because they don't have the financial resources to get involved. Two, the Great Depression's going on, and they're trying to fix their own problems. And three, they just got out of a world war, and they're really not trying to get into another one again. But right now, we can see that the Spanish War is really a puppet war, because you have fascists on one side who are supporting their side, and you have communists in the Soviet Union supporting their side on another. Why is this important? Because both sides commit atrocities that would preview the violence that they're going to be using in World War II. Also, Franco won the Civil War. Remember, Franco is a fascist. And he established a fascist totalitarian dictatorship similar to Italy and Germany. So now we know that we had 3 fascist dictators before, and now we have a 4th. This is going to start to make the Western democracies think, can this become a larger thing than what it is right now? Also, we have inaction by the Western democracies fueled by the Axis powers' ideals of expansion. So again, we have all of these players, and they're all fighting against each other, and really they're just trying to see who can have the most influence, who can have the most access to resources through imperialism, and who can do the most without being called out by anyone. Because right now, nobody's calling out fascists. They're kind of just turning the other cheek and hoping that they don't come to their door. But things are going to escalate even more.
A lot of aggression, lots of war. How did the Spanish Civil War encourage totalitarian aggressions? Again, how did the Spanish Civil War encourage totalitarian aggressions?
Good job. Thank you for responding to that and going through the first part of our lesson on the aggression and appeasement that we're seeing within the 1930s and 1940s. I hope you guys definitely got something for that, because we're going to be diving into part 2 real soon and seeing how these things will blow up even more into the thing we call World War II. But that's it for us right now, guys. Thank you so much. I'm Mr. Martinez.
I'm Miss Garcia.
Mr. Santiago here.
And it's time for us signing out. Thank you so much, and make sure you do finish the rest of today's lesson that is being asked of you.